It is exciting to be able to moderate a panel with folks that were together 4 years ago for a journey to see a preschool promise actualized and issue 44 pass. So this morning we spent a lot of time looking at Undivided and learning about Crossroads Church and their commitment, their growing commitment to racial reconciliation and racial justice. This afternoon, we want to really lean more into the politics side. So you know, the part of what you heard referenced this morning was that Undivided particularly launched something called the Justice Team that got very involved with the Amos Project, which I directed at the time, and got really involved in issue 44 with 250 volunteers knocking doors, making phone calls just from Crossroads Undivided Justice Team. So we're going to talk about that broader campaign and a little bit about how Crossroads fit into that story. So first thing I'd love to do is hear from each of you about why you got involved in, first of all, a preschool promise. I'm going to start with you, Stephanie, since you were one of the very first people to begin to dream about this when you were leading Success by Six at the United Way. So,
Sure.
Stephanie?
Thanks, Troy, and thank you for being here, and I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation. It allowed me to go back and think about what was a difficult time, but in retrospect, probably one of the most important things that I've done in my career, and I think it's benefited the community. As Troy mentioned, I'd been with United Way leading the Success by Six work, and Success by Six's focus was on kindergarten readiness and what we as a community need to do to make sure that our youngest citizens were prepared for school so that they followed the trajectory that we knew was true for young children. If they were ready for kindergarten, they were more likely to be reading proficiently by third grade, more likely to do well in eighth grade math, more likely to graduate from high school and go on to being contributors to our community and society as a whole. But what led me to that work really was where we were in Cincinnati back in 2001. And I started the work at United Way in Success by Six largely because of the civil unrest that happened here in 2001. And my interest in staying in Cincinnati after a lot of debate and reflection and discussions with my family, because I was at a point of wanting to leave the city. But with the work that was done with the CAN Commission, Cincinnati Community Action Now, it really gave me hope that the community was looking at root causes and trying to do things that would get us to a better place by looking at some of the drivers of why we ended up where we were. And Success by Six was founded out of that work. And to me, it became an issue of equity. Because we knew then that the children who had issues with police, who ended up being in the juvenile justice system, oftentimes did not have the start that they needed to be successful in school, didn't have the opportunities. And those opportunities started as early as preschool, and having a high-quality preschool experience, and parents who knew how to access those systems so that their children could participate. And so for me, the work at Success by Six that then led to the Preschool Promise was really rooted in how do we make sure that every child has a fair start. Just like my children, I had the fortune of being able to put them in preschool, change them if I wasn't happy with the preschool that they were in, understand what quality looked like from my lens. And it really is not something that should be based on your resources, but really something that's available to all families. And so being a part of Success by Six and subsequently Preschool Promise was because we really need to make sure that children have an equal start, equal access to a quality start, and the Preschool Promise allowed that to happen. We did a lot of data to confirm that with our own local data and kindergartners, and so it really made sense that the Preschool Promise was the next step after the work we had done in the Success by Six initiative. Great, thanks, Stephanie. And then Gary, I'm not exactly sure when you got involved in Preschool Promise, but I think you were engaged before I was, so fairly early on. You have a history of I think you worked for Steve Shabbat for a while. You'd been involved in the political realm, decided to lead the Cincinnati Business Committee in that role. Of all the things that the CBC, which I think represents some of the Fortune 500 companies here in Greater Cincinnati, why did you decide this is something we want to engage as business leaders here in the Greater Cincinnati community?
Sure. So the CBC has a long history of engagement in education issues, primarily working to improve education outcomes for kids in the community. And so that probably goes back to the 70s. I started here in the late 90s. We were still involved in those efforts, both education and kind of economic growth, which highly connected issues in the community. So we started having conversations with Strive, with Stephanie and United Way, with all the folks involved in what are those drivers that are going to improve those outcomes for kids, and how do we make sure those are aligned with public school efforts, parochial school efforts, and everything else going on in town. So we had been working on it around the edges for a while, and then as it got closer to the time where some of the coalitions had been built and it was starting to really gather steam, we kind of sat down with some of the key principals and said, okay, how do we do this the right way? What are the economics of it? How do we align it with CPS and other systems? And what are those steps we need to take? So we kind of launched from there.
Great. And then Elizabeth, share a little about your connection to Preschool Promise, and you actually come out of Crossroads. And so can you share just the story of how you got involved and then why
Sure.
you really decided to be all in
Absolutely.
in 2016 on this?
Absolutely. So I'm a product of Cincinnati Public Schools, first and foremost. I'm grateful. That's right. That's right. And I'm grateful for the schooling that I did have. And I come from two very different schools inside of CPS, which was Bond Hill and then Indian Hill. And so to see such a vast difference in what's possible has always stirred me to believe that there was something that's possible for all kids in Cincinnati. And I was at Crossroads during the time. I was on the prayer team. I was a facilitator for Undivided. And that's when I met you, really. And with Carolyn and a couple of key folks, we got together and really prayerfully considered building a justice team that would make sure that justice was a central part of our faith expression in this world. And so I think that group started with like 12 of us, and slowly it grew and grew and grew. And with your direction, Troy, you got me involved with speaking at the school board meetings. Slowly but surely, I was becoming a poster mother almost for Preschool Promise. I have two small people of my own, and because of Preschool Promise, my son was able to go to preschool. And that's really important to me because he's reading at a phenomenal level now, and he's 6. So it's like my family has been direct recipients of the work that we did. And I did it because I knew that without it, there were so many kids in Cincinnati who were unable to access the things that we needed to make sure that they access so that Cincinnati can be a leader in our country and we can be one of the most equitable cities in the country. And I believe that Preschool Promise was a part of making sure that that happened. So after my heart aligned with the mission, it was easy to continue to say yes. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, part of what, as folks have studied, what became, so Preschool Promise eventually became Issue 44. One of the things that Dr. Hari Hahn and others have commented about is we had a lot of unusual bedfellows that made this happen.
Yeah.
So I'm particularly interested first from you, Stephanie, what role did the coalition play, and why was that so important to make this happen?
It would be an understatement to say that the coalition was everything. Being at United Way, our role as a Impact United Way was to demonstrate that the work that we were doing was having an impact in the community. And a lot of the work, most of the work, all of the work of Success by 6 was around impact for young children. And we did a lot of data collection, a lot of funding, a lot of fundraising to be able to make the case for children being prepared for kindergarten as a result of the strategies that we knew made a contribution to that. But we didn't have data, and so we focused a lot on the data. Our relationship, though, with Strive took it to another level of really
And
looking
Strive,
at Strive is an education collective impact initiative. At that time, focused on kindergarten readiness, 3rd grade reading, eighth grade math, and then making sure that children were prepared to matriculate into high school and to have a robust high school career. And I'm really paraphrasing because it's been a long time. But they were a critical partner from the standpoint of connecting us to the pipeline and making sure that the data that we were collecting in the early years connected to third grade reading so that we could make the case for kindergarten readiness driving third grade reading. And so that partnership was early and really important to us beginning to look at the continuum of results. But as we looked at the importance of getting a ballot initiative passed and creating the community will to allow us to head in that direction, it was clear that we could not do that as two organizations and that other relationships were absolutely necessary. Both those who were in the early childhood community who Success by Six had worked with, because we worked with the providers and the preschool programs, but in terms of getting the grassroots kind of interest and understanding of why it was important. We thought it was the most important thing our city could be doing, but we really had to convince others of that. And that's not the work that United Way did. And so it was really important for us to rely on our partnership with others to make that happen, who had those relationships, who could reach multiple congregations of people. So it made sense that at some point we partnered with Amos. We also partnered with the Chamber of Commerce Leadership Cincinnati program to create that buzz around kindergarten readiness and preschool. And they had a very successful project of bringing the preschool promise to life through Every Child for a Chair for Every Child. And what we called then was the Preschool Promise Pledge. And we committed to getting almost 10,000 signatures. We didn't get quite there, but got pretty close to that. But just the importance of having multiple people buying into what we thought was the most important strategy for the community, getting their commitment to that, and then creating the groundswell of support to make it successful.
And Gary, you've been involved in a lot of political campaigns over the years. What did you see? Why was a coalition important? Because ultimately we were talking about putting a tax increase on the ballot.
Right.
So why did you instinctively know we need a broad coalition to make this happen?
Well, I think we knew that it touched on so many different parts of the community that had been brought up that the most important thing was going to be find that alignment between different groups if we were going to get this passed. And if you step back, I think, as Stephanie said, we had some really good data locally with the work they had done, Success by Six. The business community, people like Jim Zimmerman and John Pepper, who were involved then and helped drive this later, were instrumental in that. But this is something still relatively new. Strive and Stephanie and others were looking at Denver and what they were doing, but it's not as if there were 20 places to benchmark and say, here's how you do this. And so our suggestion was, look, to get everybody on the same page, we need good data. We need to figure out what this would look like, and we need to kind of bring people to coalesce around a common set of ideas. And so we put together a group led by the business community and some of the foundation community that brought in Rand, and we asked Rand to look at both nationally what was going on and what was the impact of preschool, which again we had good local data, but let's look nationally too, and then really look locally about what was having the most impact and what were the opportunities. And so that data kind of gave us a roadmap. There are a lot of decisions to make, and I think that's where those different groups came in to say, okay, here's the data in front of us. Here's what we can see locally. Here's what we can see nationally. What do we need to do? How much is it going to cost? Where should we direct resources? And those were a lot of hard discussions, but if you did it based on the data and the research that had been done, what we had and what we brought in, it made it a lot easier to get to that point. And then at the same time, as we were thinking about the partnership with Cincinnati Public, they were looking to go on the ballot with their own levy. They were looking at potentially doing their own preschool program. Two competing initiatives wasn't going to be a good thing. So we also had a group of business leaders, and at that time we had both CBC and a couple years earlier, Cincinnati Regional Business Committee was started, which was mid-cap companies. So between the two organizations, we have about 120 CEOs or top local execs. Several of those were already involved through United Way or Strive or preschool in different ways, and so they helped do a financial review of Cincinnati Public Schools, look at how much money did they need in the levy, how much would potentially need to go to preschool. And with that data, I think we were able to get people around a table to sit down and have those conversations about, how much money do we need, what's the best way to get it, how do we work together to move this forward.
And at some point along the line, Amos got involved. And Stephanie, and try not to be too self-serving here, but what was the impact when late 2014 into 2015, Amos decided, hey, we're gonna really throw down on Preschool Promise? What was the impact of that for what was happening?
Well, it was huge. We had developed what we thought was a valid business case for preschool. Had one presentation at the CBC and got some feedback that we needed to think about the funding mechanism that we were recommending, because at that time we were looking at an earnings tax, which was not popular at that time. And so we were scratching our heads and trying to figure out how do we get to the next level, and what is that next level? And that's when we realized that having the groundswell of support that was needed quickly was really, really important, and that the issues of equity made it imperative that we move forward, because we had such good data that showed that low-income children, particularly low-income African-American children who had a preschool experience, did so much better when they went into kindergarten. So it was a really, really compelling case, and did not want to walk away from the opportunity. At that point, the Leadership Cincinnati Class 36 had done the Cheer for Every Child. We had gotten a number of signatures on the Preschool Promise Pledge. We just were really at a loss for what the next step would be. And I know you were in Leadership Cincinnati Class 13 maybe, or was it 12?
39.
I'm sorry, I said 12. Yeah, 39, so it was Class 36.
Yeah, I was back in 1979. I was part of the...
Yeah, right. So it was Leadership Cincinnati Class 36, 2012. We were looking at people who had participated in that. I think you had been a participant. We thought, how do we get Troy to the table and the work that Amos is doing? And I know Greg had a lot of conversations with you about how to do that, and it was a perfect match for the kind of quick scale up that we needed to reach more people and get them engaged in the importance of the work.
Okay, switching that out. Okay, so Elizabeth, so one of the things Amos did was, we knew the RAND study was going on. We were not a part of that. And so we said, let's create our own agenda. And that became the People's Platform for Universal Preschool, which was about 4-month process with hundreds of people contributing. We had a public meeting in late 2015 where 500 people unanimously endorsed the People's Platform. Could you describe, as you started getting involved in early 2016, how the People's Platform connected with you and made you feel like, oh, this is something I want to throw down on, and these are the principles I want to, and the principles were, put myself on the spot, respect every child, racial equity, family voices at the center, and only good jobs.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think
Quality seats.
It wasn't one of the 4, but yeah.
I think having those 4 tenets as our guiding principles automatically made me feel at home, and want to engage in this, because so often we ignore race when we talk about the disparities. It's easier to just kind of put race away as like something that we don't necessarily talk about, but we know it's there. And so when I started to engage in Preschool Promise, to understand that we have the statistic of 3 out of 4 children in Cincinnati who are children of color live in poverty. And this was a part of the deciding factor of Amos getting engaged with Preschool Promise, to make sure that all children were able to have a good, healthy start. It made me feel seen as one of those little kids who was the 3 out of 4 living in poverty, And so it was easy for me to understand that because I have the torch now, that I have to carry it and light it for other people. And I have the ability to use my voice to get engaged, and Amos was that space for me where I felt like I could use my voice to get engaged, and also to help other people who were like me to understand that this is for us. And so having the voices at the center as well is a very organic way to organize and to get people to see themselves in the story. Because it's easy for us to look at Preschool Promise and say, that's just for the poor kids. and say that because I'm affluent or because I have money to pay for my children's preschool, that I don't necessarily need to vote for that or fight for that or get engaged for that. But as a person of faith, it's my duty, to make sure that children have what they need. It's in all of our holy texts to make sure that we are taking care of the children because they cannot take care of themselves. And so Preschool Promise was a way for me to do that.
So part of what is the backdrop of this, too, is Cincinnati had been named the city with the second highest child poverty rate in the country, 53%, back about 5 or 6 years ago. And it's still way higher than we wish it was. And the Urban League of Southwest Ohio came out with a statistic right in the middle of the campaign that 74% of black children under the age of 6 in the city of Cincinnati were living below the federal poverty line. And the federal poverty, you can be poor and be above the federal poverty line. It's very low. So 3 out of 4. And so there was a sense we've got to do something. And one of the things that the People's Platform said, probably its most controversial part, was under racial equity. The sentence was, and this, we got pushed, we have to be bolder on race, was what we heard over and over again. We said, begin with black and brown children. So Preschool Promise doesn't repeat the inequities that, and I didn't say baked into the system, but that we knew without an intentional naming and focus that we could create new revenue and it would just continue to repeat the same disparities that are already there. I think someone earlier said, I think it was Cameron, you don't need a racist in the room to create racial disparities. And we knew that it was baked in. There was a crucible moment for Preschool Promise. There was a meeting we had, I believe, in February or early March at the Mercantile Library that Greg Landsman, who was leading Preschool Promise effort, where we had a group of about 15 allies sitting in that room. Amos was there. And we basically said, we're going to go after an income tax or an earnings tax to fund preschool. And that was our commitment to each other. And that we were going to make that happen. And then I went on vacation. I was in Phoenix watching a Red Spring training game or something, trying to enjoy myself, and I get a call from Greg. And it was one of the most unpleasant calls I've had, which was saying, we can't do an earnings tax. Basically, the folks had decided that we can't have a Cincinnati Public Schools ballot initiative on the ballot at the same time as a preschool ballot initiative, that they would hurt each other. Now, whether, I wasn't particularly on board with that, and Amos was very frustrated that we felt like a decision was made that we were not part of. So we had a decision to make. What do we do in that moment? And it was not one of my finer moments, but I flew a red eye back to Cincinnati. We met in this very building. I think, and it's a little hazy, but I think I accused the school board of being in the pocket of the CBC and selling out the community. I don't know that I did that, but I think I may have.
Impassioned,
And I think folks knew that, I was not happy, and Amos's board and people were not happy with where things are. And so we went through about a month period of trying to figure out how to move forward. So Gary, it was in that crucible that we met, had a cup of coffee at Starbucks, and shared our common effect. We may not have had a lot of commonalities, but we both liked Indiana basketball, so there was that connection.
That's right.
And shared pain over the last 30 years of Indiana basketball.
Yes.
But I'm just curious. I don't even know if I've ever asked you this before. You had a deal cut, and then who are these pesky folks that are making us come to New Prospect Baptist Church and get grilled around the People's Platform? How are you feeling during that period?
Yeah, I think, Troy, what we both realized, right, when we sat down to talk is there are a lot of good-meaning people having these conversations. You mentioned some meetings you were in with folks, that we may not have been participating in. There are others that we were in. Greg and others, Stephanie, sometimes, we're kind of acting as liaisons with different groups trying to pull everybody together. And I think what we realized is we didn't know each other. We hadn't really sat down and talked. And it goes back to this whole, how did we get where we ended up? which was, I think we had a lot of the same common goals, and we just had to have those conversations, right, to really understand where each side was kind of coming from. And I say side, but I think generally we're all trying to accomplish, the same thing. And so I think as we sat down and had those conversations, realized, okay, maybe you weren't aware of some of the conversations, we weren't aware of some of the conversations, let's kind of pull this all back together. And in our minds, I think, we had Tom Williams and Michael Fisher and a couple others from the business
Share who
community.
those folks are.
Yeah, I think Tom Williams, was chairing the CBC at that time, but a former chair of ours who had also chaired our education committee, been very engaged in the work in the community, runs a business, North American Properties, and Michael Fisher, the CEO of Children's Hospital, and so they had both been very involved. So I think we got them as representatives from the business community. I think John was there too,
John
as
Pepper was
well,
on the
and John
panel,
came as well as a former member of the CBC. And I think it was great to have that opportunity to have that dialogue. Now, you're right. You don't know exactly what it's going to lead to and what's going to come out of it. But I think, that opportunity to say, hey, we've all been talking about the same things. It's time to get together and have this very honest conversation about what are we trying to do? Why are we making suggestions that we're making? And how do we move forward together?
But there was some nervousness. So basically in early April, I remember it was early April because Tom Williams is one of the co-owners of the Reds, and the Reds had a miraculous first week. I think it went downhill right after that, but I remember comments about that. But there were nerves about coming to a traditionally black church, New Prospect Baptist Church, Damon Lynch III's congregation, to have to answer questions around the People's Platform, and all these nightmare scenarios about what could end up happening, because we're talking about politics, we're talking about race, we're talking about poverty, we're talking about the community. So how did you work through the nervousness yourself and with some other folks from the CBC and the chamber to say, we're going to show up there, we're going to have the courage to step into something we can't totally control?
Right.
How did that process work?
Yeah, I think you and I talked a little bit at the time too, having been in politics and organized and been involved in a lot of town hall meetings, you know how that can go, right? You can have a great town hall meeting, or you can have 50 people that show up and protest and, make it somewhat unproductive, right?
Yeah.
And so I think our goal there was, we're looking to have productive conversations. We're not looking for a situation where people are getting up and yelling and screaming, because that's not going to advance this. And I think, that was our concern going in. How do we make sure, that this is structured in a way that it's really productive and helping us get to where we're trying to get, and it's not just some type of, yelling and screaming and arguing about, where we've been. So, how do we kind of set that up and educate people about what we're trying to accomplish? And I think that's what we were able to do. And I think you and your team and everybody involved in it, was able to set a format up that said, okay, let's make this constructive and try to move forward from here.
Yeah, I think it's important, and John Pepper is out of town, but he played a really critical role. So John is the former CEO of Procter & Gamble, the former chair of the board of Disney. He came to a board meeting with Amos to try to, because we were angry. I remember, one of the stories I remember about John is at that meeting he said, well, I remember being at a meeting with, and Steve said, and he was talking about Steve Jobs, to name drop Steve Jobs in a meeting with the Amos board was kind of interesting. But I found it just surreal. But he was basically saying, we've got to figure this out. There's too much on the line for children. This is an opportunity, something to be involved in that could really reshape. And one thing that Amos was committed to is we had voted on the People's Platform, and we basically said, we're not going to cut a deal without our people. And so we actually had a vote at the end of that time. Yeah. And 90% of the people said, let's go ahead. Let's charge ahead and negotiate with all the other parties to do a shared property tax with Cincinnati Public Schools, $48 million a year, $15 million dedicated to high-quality preschool. And we said, we're down for that eventually. Yeah. And Elizabeth, once we were down for it, can you just describe your activity at Crossroads and what you got engaged with?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I see my sister over there, Carolyn Heck, who is co-leading the Justice team with me. And like I said, and she's probably mentioned, we started off with a handful of people and a prayer. And slowly but surely, as we started to stake our claim in this justice arena and say Crossroads is going to get down and dirty with what we need to do to make sure that children have equitable beginnings, more and more people just became abundantly clear that this was something that our folks wanted to do. And I think it was around July when we really voted to make sure, or had the conversation to make sure that we wanted to put our weight behind this. I think for Crossroads, it's a big deal for an institution our size to engage in anything like this. And so we, as the justice team, made sure that it was bubbling up from the bottom and slowly rising up to leadership to let them know that we're in, we're just so in on making this happen. So we've got a couple of amazing leaders who really made sure that our volunteers were engaged. I see Shannon right there, I see Kim, I see Audrey. I mean, we've got a squad of people in here, Cameron, and we slowly started to funnel in hundreds of volunteers, hundreds of volunteer hours, hundreds of people who were knocking on doors, who were making phone calls, who were writing postcards, who were showing up on Park Avenue and Walnut Hills to figure out how could we make sure that we were living out this tenet of our faith, to make sure that justice is rolling down like a mighty river, like a mighty stream. And for us, it was easy to say yes to this. And because of that, when I look out at this room right now and I see so many of our folks, like, I feel like I'm in a family of people who aligned around this shared vision. And the win was so impactful for us because we knew that our engagement helped tip the scale. To see Crossroads come swinging for this, it really did help tip the scale. So
Yeah, I don't think.
Yeah. Thanks, Elizabeth.
I agree. Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, when you talk about elections and candidates, people are always passionate about their candidate.
Yeah.
They want to get out, they want to work, they want to go door to door. It happens. On issue campaigns, it's usually only if it's people that are against something.
Yeah.
That's where you see the energy and the motivation is that they want to stop it. And this was really, one of the first times I really ever seen that kind of groundswell of support, on the pro side of something to get out and want to get it passed. And I had people professionally that I interact with that are members at Crossroads that were coming up to me, in meetings, before meetings, and saying, hey, I know you're involved in this, and I'm volunteering, and, our church is volunteering, and I was at a meeting. I mean, it happened so many times that it was just very inspiring, right, to have people coming up on the street just saying, hey, I know you're involved in this. This is great. We're out there volunteering. We're going door to door, and it made a huge, huge difference.
And I think it's worth pointing out how rare it is for a congregation to get deeply involved in anything political.
Yep.
To have folks including, so Chuck Mingo was a co-chair of the campaign.
Yes.
Chuck Mingo was in a commercial asking people to raise taxes at an evangelical church in Cincinnati. That doesn't happen. And so I think that part of this story and the fact that Crossroads Undivided Justice Team could connect with Amos and be part of this pretty sophisticated ground game of door knocking and phone calls was a big reason why this was the biggest victory for a new education tax levy in Cincinnati history.
Yeah.
Over 62% of the people voted yes for the public schools and for preschool promise. And that doesn't happen very often, right? And there are tax levies for education that get voted down every year in this region. This one won overwhelmingly. And so it is one of the highlights. I know the implementation is challenging, and it's really exciting to hear, Elizabeth, you say, my son has benefited from something we worked on together. And there's a few thousand children already that are in preschool today that would not be if not for this really important victory. So what I'm going to do now in the next couple minutes is ask a few questions that have come in from the audience. So we thank you. If you have a question, there's the link up there to send one in. First question, and anyone can answer this. What would you recommend as first steps for someone to get more involved in local government to have a voice in the community on important issues. Where does somebody start to get involved in local government and local issues?
I would say in your community. Every jurisdiction in this county, in this state, has either a village council, a community council, and it really starts by getting to know who's leading in those forums and whether or not they're doing the things that you want to have done. I've lived in Glendale for almost 30 years, and when I have a complaint, I go, but I really should go all the time because they're making decisions with the money that I am contributing. And I think it starts with being involved at whatever local is to you. Certainly that could be Cincinnati City Council or Hamilton County Commission. But you have to at least understand what's on the agenda and how does that align with what's important to you.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth, what would you say to this question, like the importance of not doing it alone?
Yeah, that's the biggest thing for me, is to find other people who share your same passion or vision or values and to start having those conversations with them about what are the issues that we're seeing right now, what are the things that we're facing that make us feel crushed or make us feel excited, and then seeking out those local organizations, or what I was going to say as well, Stephanie took the words right out of my mouth, the community councils, and aligning with people, because if you do it alone, you're going to burn out.
Gary, any final thought on that?
No, I think that's right, and I think a lot of the organizations, like a United Way, if there's issues that you're passionate about that United Way is working on, they have a government affairs team. There's ways they can help you get involved too around those specific issues.
So there's another question. The more divided we are, the less we can focus on key issues. What are some ways to pull people together so we can focus on issues that affect us all? Like, this is kind of a lessons learned.
Yeah.
Like, what did we see in issue 44 in preschool promise that we can apply to other challenges at the city, county, state, or even federal level?
I would say that the first thing is to always look for common ground, no matter what. Always look for common ground in conversations. And we call it resonating, right? So if somebody is expressing a value to them that you might not necessarily agree with, look for how you resonate with them so that you can say, you know what, I felt that too. And here's how I feel when that happens. And then immediately you found a friend. So.
Any other thoughts on how to pull people together?
Well, I think to Elizabeth's point, it's understanding that there may be others who are doing similar work, but different in the way that you're doing it. And one of the successes that I believe we had is that we made education a factor across the education sector, not just public schools. And I believe that the home-based providers and the community-based providers have been disenfranchised and not seen as educators, and they truly are educators. And if you want to be successful, you have to look at the different ways that work is happening in your community and not expect that one way is the best way. And our doing that and building a relationship, and the trust has not yet been established at the level that it should be, but it never will be if you aren't at the same table. And I think having them at the table really helped us to succeed.
Yeah, and I think that you're just reminding me about the central role of Black women in the run-up to preschool promise, often the ones who are most in need of preschool for their children, often the providers, the teachers, the independent. And so, like most great change in this country, Black women were at the heart of this effort on issue 44 and preschool promise, and making sure that there's a coalition that includes those most directly affected is vital for pulling people together.
And having white men who say that is key too, for real. White men who recognize that. So I'm just like
So we have, I think I'm going to only have time for one more question. There's several here that are really good. Leaning in, this is one we're going to go with, leaning into the new decade here in 2020. What are your thoughts on the role of United Way to bring a diverse group of stakeholders together to advance racial equity in other areas of the community? I'm going to say United Way and other groups, but United Way's had some challenges lately, and he spent a lot of time there. What role can groups like the United Way play moving forward on some of the biggest challenges we're facing as a community?
I'll take that one to start with, just because I spent 14 years there, and I still see that work as being critically important to our community. And I think United Way, can you hear me? Is that better?
You need
Sorry.
to hold that
Okay.
up. Yeah.
So United Way has seen itself as a convener and has brought together many sectors of the nonprofit community. It also has strong relationships with the business community. It is in a position to be able to educate all parties on the importance of equity, on justice, and how race plays such a factor in our results in this community. We've got data that shows that. And to create the conversation that needs to be had around how we get better as a city. Really, if not United Way, who? Because of the role that they do have and the trust that they have in the business community, and I think an evolving trust in the community at large. Evolving because there's a lot of opportunity that's been missed in terms of the conversations that have been had and how funding to support the work that would begin to alleviate poverty, or at least put a dent in it, should not be forced. It should be a function of what the organization does. And I believe the organization is getting better at that and has the opportunity to continue to grow in that realm. But it has to be a part of the conversation because of its ability to bring the parties together.
Yeah, and I think anything big that's going to happen in this community, having a coalition that includes people directly affected, groups like the Amos Project or the Homeless Coalition on Housing. There's some big challenges facing this community. Transportation right now is on the ballot here in the next 2 months, I think, in terms of a much needed investment in public transit. There's obviously a lot of challenges around housing that I travel the country now. It's everywhere. Yeah. Affordable housing is such a challenge. The only way to do that is to have United Way be one of those who's a bridge builder to bring folks together. Part of what, as we close, I just think it's important to say is part of what Undivided really pushes folks to do is sit around a table, sit around a group, learn how to empathize, learn how to connect, commit to each other. And part of the success of Issue 44 and Preschool Promise actually winning was that value being embodied by the business community, the teachers union, Cincinnati Public Schools, parents, providers, community members, the faith community. And it's, I think, always going to be one of the great highlights and thrills of my life to have been a part of it with each of you and so many hundreds of others. So thank you very much.
Thank you.